Good morning, everybody. This is Walk the Dog with Riot Mort. It is Wednesday, and it was supposed to be patch day according to the schedule, but as I kind of was worried about, because it was a holiday, the patch was delayed a day. So the patch is now on the 29th, which means it's tomorrow. So a little frustrating, kind of like, we know the pattern, we know it's a holiday that happens, but the schedule is wrong, which is frustrating because had I known that, I would have been able to do an A patch yesterday for like the one thing I feel like is off, and wasn't able to do that. So now, so here's one of those like really, really tough situations where it's like, okay, I looked at the data. I spent all day looking into the data. Yes, not all day. I spent some time yesterday looking at the data and certainly comparing it to when we first prepared the patch, where, to give you an idea, Morgana was the 10th best one cost 3-star, and we almost buffed her. Thank God we didn't. And then fast forward to now, and it's like, yep, she is the number one cost 3-star, with number 2 being Poppy, Now, don't get me wrong, it's not by like a massive margin. This isn't like, we've seen way, 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 way worse, right? Like, she's the strongest, but it's like, it's close, right? Like, it's literally Morgana, Poppy, Shaco, So it's not like it's like way off, but it's the kind of thing that like, had I had time to prepare the patch today, would I make another change? Yeah, probably. And Nico and I were looking at like what aspect of it needed to be nerfed, right? Because one of the other things that happens, and this drove me nuts, it still does drive me nuts to some extent, if I'm being honest. And there's a car very early. Jesus. I'm gonna wait till they go by. Okay. One of the things that drives me nuts is that, people will be like, I can't believe they didn't nerf Morgana. But they're not actually saying they want Morgana the champion specifically nerfed. Morgana is their shorthand for, that is the comp that I want nerfed. It just, Morgana is the carry of that composition, right? And there's this like lack of communication skills that causes people to go, it definitely is the carry that must be nerfed, as opposed to anything else. But we actually looked into it, and it was like, Morgana seemed generally fine. And in fact, Morgana without 6 Bastion performs absolutely garbage. Morgana in Divinicore, kind of garbage. Even Morgana and 6 Bruiser, not actually that great, which is kind of the comp we expected her to be good in. Which means it's probably like not Morgana that needs nerfed. Then it's like Poppy within Cyberboss. Is Poppy in Cyberboss that good? Not really. Which leads you to believe that, like, if you're going to nerf anything, it's probably either specifically Poppy's spell armor contribution, because he gets so much armor from Bastion. And remember, Bastion's like double armor for the first bit of the fight. So, yeah. That's what makes Poppy hit so hard at the beginning of the fight. Or it's literally just 6 Bastion, right? But like, even 6 Bastion feels weird because it's not like 6 Bastion, literally anything else is performing well, right? There's no 6 Bastion, Zeri comp or anything like that. So, and this is one of the tricky things about balance, right? Is it's like, any individual factor within itself seems relatively fine, if not even underperforming, but it is that specific combination of the elements that is overperforming. And that's where, in that case, you have to kind of use your judgment and sort of go, okay, what is the specific case that needs to be adjusted, right? Or what is the specific thing that feels frustrating, right? Like Morgana in particular, she's a dot champion, so she's going to have those moments where she's like doing high DPS and healing and stuff like that. So that's kind of intended. But to me, I lean more towards it's like that Bastion, like that first 10 seconds of a Bastion fight where there's just like, it feels like you're doing nothing to them. I feel like that's going to be the frustrating element. So TLDR here is, if I had infinite time and could snap my fingers, would I have A-patched a Bastion 5 armor nerf? Yeah, I absolutely would have, but now you have this situation where it's like, can you justify an entire micro patch just to go Bastion -5 armor and MR? Not really. And in fact, my boss would sort of be like, you're tinkering, stop it, leave it alone, it's fine. So it's like, because 14.4 was a very, very good meta. Very good. Was it perfect? No. But in that pursuit of perfect, is that where I should be using the resources to try to make sure it's as perfect as it can? Or should I be using that time to continue to improve and balance 15 and get that ready, which has bigger yields on return, And that's the challenge, right? Like, there is no magic thing. We can't just do it all, snap our fingers. But yeah, I know this isn't really any question, by the way. This is just me talking about the meta and the things I've been thinking through yesterday. But yeah, it's interesting. If you compare it to TFT Academy's tier list right now, it's like there's 2 S tier comps on their list right now, which is AMP, which is getting nerfed. That flat HP does so many weird things, so that's getting nerfed. And then there's Morgana Bastion, which isn't being nerfed. And then if you look at all their C tier comps, which is like LeBlanc, Vayne, like those are getting buffed. But there's an interesting self-reporting thing here where it's like, I almost wonder how much of their tier list is based off the fact that, because sometimes I'll catch Froden saying something like, oh, well, they're buffing this, so it must be bad, so let's change it on the tier list, So there's a little bit of like self-reinforcement. So it's one of the reasons why I have to be careful when using a site like that as a resource for player perception. Hell, a week and a half ago, Morgana wasn't even on their tier list. So it's interesting. Anyway, those are kind of my morning thoughts heading into the day as we head into the patch. I'm definitely a little nervous about the Bastion Morgana stuff. It's possible, though. The one thing I could see, like, shaking it up is that the Ginsus, we're shipping new Ginsus relatively strong, and new Ginsus can do well into those comps. So maybe, a similar comp with a good front line can counter the Bastion Morgana comp enough, kind of like we saw with Street Demon. So we'll see. But yeah, okay, cool. Let's get to questions. Sorry about that long opening of random thoughts here. First question is kind of a hard one. What is the value of player agency determined in TFT resources? Now, this question's a bit buzzwordy, so let me rephrase that for anyone who's curious what the hell this means. Typically, we have values associated with any of our given rewards. So an example here would be like, if I'm going to give you a component, or I'm going to give you gold, how much gold is that component worth? And over the years, we've approximated it to roughly 8 gold, okay? A component is worth 8 gold. Now, you might be going, well, that's weird. Is that really true? And the answer with everything in TFT is, it depends. On 2-1, would you rather have a component or 8 gold? 8 gold, easy. On 5-1, would you rather have a component or 8 gold? Component, easy. Not even close. The value of gold is extremely high early and falls off late, right? So, morning. So when we use these approximations, they are approximate given any point in the fight. But they need to be taken into account when you're getting the thing, right? So if you're designing a 4-2 augment and comparing it to that, you can't do that. So, but let's go back and say, let's go back and say a component is 8 gold. Okay. Now, that's a random component, right? What about a component anvil? Is that more or less than a random component? Well, obviously it has to be more, right? Like, and the way we judge this is basically what you have to do is think about it in terms of the best, average, and worst cases, and what do we think that means? And there's no like mathematical proof. There's no perfect science here. But let's say I hand you a random component. And the worst thing that can happen to you is you get another cloak and you already have 2 cloaks. Is that really that bad? It's annoying, but it's not that bad. And the best thing you could get is the exact tier you need to finish your blue buff. And that's pretty big. That's good impact, right? But the average is like, a sword, whatever. The difference between those cases is not that extreme, right? And so the difference in value is not going to be that intense. Now, a component anvil essentially says, hey, the worst thing that can happen is we're going to show you the 4 worst components you could get, which is, let's say number 5, 6, 7, 8 on your wish list. And then you're going to take number 5. So the worst thing that could happen is you get the 5th best component for your build. The best thing that can happen is you get the component you want. And the average is much higher because the odds of seeing it, just all you have to do is see it, is so much higher. But again, what's the difference between getting your 5th best component and your best component? It's not that big. So in that term, it's like probably 1 to 2 gold of value, right? It's not that big an extreme. If a component is 8 gold on average, getting your best component is probably like 9 gold on average. Not that big a deal. But this gets more and more complicated as time goes on, right? If I hand you a random full item, right, what's that value relative to 2 components? Right, if I hand you 2 random components, then that's 16 gold. Then you have the agency to build what you want using your other components and things like that. If I hand you a random item, the worst case scenario is you get a Morello when you already have a Sunfire. Or you're playing an AP comp and I give you a Deathblade. The worst case scenario is pretty bad, actually. And the best case scenario is not even that much better, right? Like 2 random components with agency, not that insane. Like you can kind of pick and you can kind of choose. So that level of like best case scenario and worst case scenario on a random full item actually leads it to be much less valuable than 2 components. And so a random full item might be valued at, say, 13 or 14 gold, as opposed to 16 gold. Because again, that agency that those 2 components provide is pretty extreme. But a component or a full item anvil, again, the worst case scenario is we show you the 4 worst items that you could want. And of those, but like, again, if you think about it in numbers, there's 35, 36 full items. So we show you number 36, 35, 34, and 33. You pick your 33rd worst item. So that's the worst case. But more likely you're going to get something higher on average. So that's probably worth, 15 gold. But again, is a full item anvil better or worse than 2 random components? Right? And like that's the judgment you have to start making as you compare and contrast things and figure out basically their min case, average case, best case. What do those equal and what's the value? And all of this is relative to some anchored term, which is, a random component. And so you go from there. And the same is actually true of champions, right? So like, how much value is a lesser duplicator worth? Well, it's not 3 gold, right? It's clearly more than 3 gold. Because, okay, yes, the best case scenario is you use it on a 3 cost, you get 3 gold of value. But the agency to pick what 3 gold it is massive. And the amount of gold it saves is massive, right? Like, you get to make a champion when your pool is at your lowest, or it's like if you get 2 jinxes out of a box and then you get a lesser duplicator, you've essentially high rolled. How much gold is that worth? How many odds is that multiplying? So that ends up inflating its value pretty high. Now, the difference with duplicators, though, is that we've specifically designed duplicators to essentially be a high roll opportunity. We design them as like, this is something you're supposed to be like, yes, I high rolled. Whereas components, that's not true. Components are just a resource that you're given, that you work with, and it is what it is. So, and again, all of this can rely to any output in our game, right? Like getting to choose an augment, what that augment provides you, how much agency is in it. But all of it goes back to analyzing the different output cases and their relative expected value to anything else. So again, to wrap this question up, I don't have like a purely mathematical, like player agency is worth 20%. That's not quite how it works. It is case dependent, but it is something you have to think about. And probably where this is the hardest is in cash out tables. When you're designing your cash out table or your rewards table, the values can change pretty drastically because of A, the agency, B, the situations you could be in, and C, when it's expected to happen, right? So, let's use the 80 gold cash out in Cypher, for example. It's funny because you get the 80 gold cash out when the thing says 70 gold of value. And I've had players be like, oh my God, that's unplayable. But the reality is, gold is less value at our current rate, given that the likeliness that you get that cash out is your late game, right? You're not getting that in stage 3. You're likely getting that in late stage 4 or early stage 5, So yeah, and so I think if you went back and looked at some of the cash out tables, and it's like, well, why is this value the way it is? It's because of where it is relative to the game time expected to get them. So there you go. Bit of a complicated question, but player agency definitely matters as it affects the average expected output of any given reward that you get. All right. Will specific augment artifacts ever come back? And the player was talking about I forget the name of it, the crit artifact that lets you, Prowler's Claw. So bad with names. Like the Prowler's Claw prismatic that gave you like a Prowler's Claw and something else, and there's like a Prowler's Claw and an IE. Will those ever come back? The answer is probably, because the funny thing is they never actually went away, right? Like if you look at the Shimmer Scale item, the augment, that's essentially the same thing, right? It's like, instead of a random artifact, you get a little agency and get to pick an artifact that is gold generating, and you can take that, and that's good. And so we think those are fine. To some extent, the Dynamo one, where you get a Monazane, is kind of like this as well. It's a specific artifact, or no, I'm sorry, now it's a Zanya's. But it's a specific artifact with just a bit of a hoop to jump through to get that specific artifact. So having specific artifact augments totally fine. I think the thing is, though, we just want to make sure that they're actually interesting. Like you used the Prowler's Claw one as an example, and we saw that one have a generally low pick rate because it was like, well, if you take this, there's like 2 champions you should be playing with it. And one of the things our best players really like is when the augment system does not narrow you down into specific lines on 2-1 especially, right? So an example of good here is like buried treasures. You're going to get 6 random components on early game. Okay, that's fine. That's not going to lock you into anything, and you can still play adaptively based on what you get. But if I specifically give you, the Dynamo augment, our top players don't really like that because like, well, it's 2-1. I've locked in my line, and now at this point, I'm just going through the motions to try to get my Dynamo stuff and sure hope I hit it, right? And, artifacts are going to be the same. And right now, I would actually say within our augment system, we kind of have an abundance of those ones that like push you into a certain direction pretty heavily. Now, I've talked about this before, but the line's really, really thin. This came up recently because we saw someone who said, you have my bow, which was the augment that gives you a bow and some attack speed. And there was a player written guide that said, you have my bow means you must play one of these two lines. And it was like, generic attack speed has locked you into a line? But, you know, at the highest level, there are players that believe that is the level of impact a small decision can make. And so the more impactful that decision is, the more players may lock themselves into that perception that that is the way they have to go. And so, like, let's take the artifacts for now. Like, let's look at the new one, like Static Shiv, right? If we were going to make a new Static Shiv augment, and let's just say it's a 2-1 prismatic, or even a 3-2 prismatic, and it says, gain a Static Shiv, and your team gains 20% attack speed, and anyone wearing a Static Shiv gains 10% more. Pretty solid augment, right? Like, that augment, if we were put that into the set right now, would basically say you need to play Twisted Fate, or maybe one other champion, right? Like, again, really locks you in. Do I believe that augment would have a very high pick rate? Probably not. Now, do I think that augment could be very fun? Yeah, I do, actually. And that's why, like, your original question is, like, would we ever make more of them? I think so. I think trying to make every augment this perfect thing that has a very high pick rate is probably a fool's errand. And it's okay to have some augments that are a bit more narrow, a bit more niche. But those are the ones that some players fall in love with, right? Like, there's a player out there right now who is very, very sad Category 5 and Shock Treatment are going away, because that was their favorite augment, you know, and they loved that play style. Someone out there feels that way. And so I don't look at those augments and go, those are bad augments because their pick rate was low. I go, those were fine augments that had their time. Players enjoyed them. But we got to keep the augment system fresh. We got to add new things. So, and in that spirit of adding new things, if we wanted to add this fake Static Shiv augment I just made up, okay, cool. Someone's probably going to like that. So, yeah, I think so. We just have to be careful, obviously, the balance, right? You know, would I give you an augment that gave you Horizon Focus and Silvermere Dawn? Probably not. Probably not, you know. So, there you go. TLDR here is, yes, I would add them again. They haven't really gone away. And if we had the right spot for them, yeah, you bet you. All right. Next one is a harder one. They had a question about the number of melee carries. Now, this came up because set 14 had very little melee carries, right? There's Shaco, Rengar, Zed, and then you hit in the 5-cost space. But the 5 costs are pretty unreliable, so you can't really force them. And this leads to things like Sterix and Titans being less desirable because there's less options to play, and there's so many more ranged champions. And then the person asked, well, it's like I've just played set 10, which had more melee champions, and how do you make the decision around how many melee champions there are? Things like that. So this is a complicated question. This is one of those very large problems in TFT. So first off, if you look at melee champions versus ranged champions, ranged champions are more intuitive and easier to play, right? You put your tanks in the front, you put your ranged champions at the back. Any new player can pretty much understand this, no problem. Good to go. Easy. And so the more ranged lines available, the odds are that newer players are going to pick an intuitive carry and be able to play that. Now, here's the problem. Or actually, there's a lot of problems, but here's some of the problems. The first is that we're a League of Legends game, which means we have League of Legends champions. You know what there are a lot of in League of Legends? Melee champions. If you go list out all the different champions, there are a lot of melee champions. There actually aren't that many ADCs in the grand scheme of League of Legends champions. There's plenty of casters, whether it be support or mid lane. But between jungle, top lane, there are a lot of melee champions. So if we were like, we don't want to use many melee champions, we are cutting out large portions of the roster, which is not good, right? So a lot of people really like those champions. Melee champions are generally pretty fun and pretty resonant with our players. Things like Yasuo, Yone, Riven. So that's not great. The next problem is, as I said, with intuitiveness, how do you position melee champions relative to tanks? If you're playing something like, what's a good example here? Let's just say Divinicorp Zed, and you've got your tank, which is Gragas in the front line, and then you've got Zed. One of the challenges is that you put Zed on the front line because he's a melee champion, or even in the second row, but then he moves first sometimes, and your Zed takes aggro before your tank. And you're like, that's frustrating. I don't want my Zed to take aggro. I want him to live and fight. I want my tank to tank. You don't get that same intuitive feeling that you get when you put your backliner Vex in the backline, and Gragas definitely takes aggro first. So it takes people a long time to figure out how to play melee champions positioning. Then we have the other deep problem with our systems, which is how mana generation works relative to survivability. Something we've had in our game for a long time is that when you take damage, you gain mana. And the idea being that this came from actually the original auto chess, and it was like to help tanks guarantee their cast before they die, right? So like if you have a tank with 3 items and they're going to take a bunch of damage, they'll get their cast off, and you'll get to see the thing do what it wants. And, if you have a tank in the front line, then that's great. But, this has some negative side effects. This is things like if I'm running Static Shiv and it hits the backline, I feel like I'm just feeding their backline mana so that they get to cast sooner than my backline. So I really just want to burst people down so that they die before I give them that mana. Well, melee champions have this problem in spades because as melee champions take damage, they gain mana, which lets them cast their spell. And then when they cast their spell, usually melee champions have something like a Bloodthirster, which causes them to heal back up. So then they take damage again, they generate mana, they cast their spell, they heal back up. And melee champions in our game have essentially become drain tanks. Rengar this set was notorious for this. Built-in healing on his kit that scaled with AP. Every time he casts, he does a big crit with some damage. Bloodthirster or Hodge heals right back up. And he was a drain tank for Jinx, not a damage dealer. And so every melee champion for the past 4 or 5 sets has this problem where they can't survive long enough at 1 star to become a drain tank, so they're garbage. At 2 star, they're like, if you have 3 items, maybe early game, again, let's use Rengar as the example. Can a 2-star Rengar survive and do a lot of work? Yeah, till about 3-5. And then he kind of becomes useless. Only at 3-star do they finally have the health gain necessary to drain tank properly. Because the other thing about our mana generation system is that it's relative to flat health. So you need to have a high health pool, right? If you have let's say it takes this is wrong, but let's say it takes 1,000 damage for you to cast your spell, to generate enough mana to cast your spell. Well, if you're a Rengar 2 with only 1,300 health, you're going to go from 1,300 to 300, cast your spell, heal up to 800, and then not be able to cast again because you don't have enough health to generate the second time. But if you're a 3-star Rengar and you've got 2,000 health, you take 1,000, you're at 1,000, you cast, you're at 1,500, go down to 500, cast again, you're at 800. You can get multiple casts off, which makes you really, really powerful. And so generally with all of our melee champions, we see this thing where it's 1 and 2-star are actually kind of borderline unplayable. And then 3-star is where it's starts to ramp up. And we saw this actually with Vex before her rework, right before we shipped, where she was supposed to be a melee champion. And again, it got to the situation where if you didn't have all the proper items and 2-star, she was a garbage champion that did nothing. But when you finally put it all together, she was this obnoxious drain tank that wouldn't die. And it's like, well, that's not great. So all of this is to say that with set 14, we took a stab of, let's just try a set with a little less drain tanks, please. But this is a long-term problem that needs to be solved. And spoiler for the few of you that actually watch this thing, we're working on this. Very, very, like, you're not going to have to wait that long for a solution to this problem. But this is why we've been sort of coy with melee drain tank champions, because that's kind of the flaw with that system, with how our mana generation works and how they respond to that stuff. So yeah. The other aspect of this that's, I'm running out of time, so I can't go into this too deeply, but basically it's like, when you look at a composition, if you have too many melee champions in your line, so let's say you're building out a trait and you want to build out duelists, and all 8 duelists are melee, trying to place your board is obnoxious, right? It's like, I only have 7 spots in the front row, so I just have an awkward person who hopes he can wrap around. That's annoying. So you probably don't want to have a trait with like a ton of melee in it. So generally when we're designing our sets, you have to make sure all your origins and classes only have so many melee. It's another reason why we don't like 8 bruiser, for example. All the bruisers are melee, so when you're playing 8 bruiser, what do? You know? So that's another aspect. But yeah, TLDR here. Melee champions, some work to do. But we understand that players find them fun. There's a lot of League of Legends champions that are melee, so we need to get them to work. We're working on it. You won't have to wait long. So there you go. Okay. I didn't get to the 4th question today. That's my bad. 3 questions today. But at least they were good, meaty ones. Hopefully these are meaty topics. If you're listening to these and you're enjoying these topics, you're a nerd. And I mean that as a compliment. You're a nerd, and I would hang out with you. I would drink a soda with you and nerd out about this stuff. This is the stuff that makes game design and games so fun to me. I love this stuff. So, okay, I'm gonna wrap this up. Patch tomorrow. We'll see how it goes. Nervous about Morgana Bastions. We'll see. So, all right, gotta wrap this up. Have a good day. Take it easy, guys. I'm gonna get to work. Take it easy.